Thank you. The American people are concerned about the issue of debt and deficits and are eager for Washington to take action. In our recent survey, the vast majority of Americans agree that the fiscal challenges are a top priority, that they want bipartisan action, and are even willing to contribute to reducing the national debt. But what will it actually take for Washington to reach a long-term agreement? As we highlighted in last year's summit, many solutions exist. But what's been missing so far is the political will to reach bipartisan agreement. Our first panel today will help us find answers as to how to build the political will to get a long-term fiscal plan put in place. To discuss these issues, we've assembled an outstanding panel of experts. Senator Rob Portman from Ohio is relatively new to the Senate, but very experienced in the ways of Washington. Having served as U.S. Trade Representative and as the Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Bush administration, prior to joining the administration in 2005, he represented the Cincinnati area in the House of Representatives for 12 years. Representative Xavier Becerra from California has served in the House for nearly 20 years and is currently Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus. In 2010, he was a member of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and last year he, like Senator Portman, served on the supercommittee that tried to reach a longer-term deficit reduction agreement. Kathleen Jamieson is a professor of communication at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School and director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center, which runs factcheck.org. The author and co-author of 15 books on politics and political communications, Dr. Jamieson is an expert on how politicians bring their messages to voters and how communications shape elections and policy. Patricia Murphy is the founder of the blog Citizen Jane Politics and covers Congress for the Daily Beast Newsweek. Patricia has her ear to the ground on Capitol Hill, having spent 9 years as a Hill staffer. She combines her reporting with a keen sense of what Americans are thinking and asking about what's happening in Washington. And the panel will be moderated by John Harris, editor-in-chief and one of the co-founders of Politico. Prior to launching Politico, John spent more than two decades at the Washington Post covering national and state politics. Please welcome our panelists.
Well, good morning. We've got 40 minutes to tackle a pretty big question, so I'll plunge right into it. The first thing I'd like our panelists to do, and I'll propose that we just go down the line, starting with Senator Portman here, is to test the premise of this panel, which, as I take it, is that substantively it might be challenging, but not really that difficult to solve the mathematics equation of the deficit, that people could sit down with a calculator and a legal pad and get it done, but that the really difficult dimension of this is the political one. And obviously this does take place in the context of a year of failure in 2011. There was a hope that, as has happened occasionally in the past in Washington, you get sort of mature, reasonable people in a room, throw the reporters out, say don't come back until you've got it solved, as was done in 1997 with President Clinton and then Speaker Gingrich, was done in 1990 with Republicans and the first President Bush, was done in 1983 with Social Security. But if you could replicate that process, get reasonable people in a room, away from the glare of the lights, that there'd be a solution to this. 2011, that proved not to be true. Simpson-Bowles didn't do anything to tackle these structural deficits. Got lots of good press. No substantive action. This extensive conversations between Speaker Boehner and President Obama ended in failure and recriminations. The supercommittee on which both of you sit didn't get the work done. So anyway, let me ask the question. If you didn't have to worry about the political blowback from your own parties and from public opinion, how difficult would it be for the two of you to sit down and come up with a solution that would be, you think, in the public interest and not violate your ideological principles? How hard substantively is this?
Say yes. It's easy.
You could do it in 20 minutes, right?
Javier and I just did it behind the curtain. We're done. Well, look, first of all, it is more difficult than it was in 1997. We're in 1990. We're in 1983. The fiscal hole that Washington has dug is deeper. And for those who say, let's just go back to what we did in '97, we had a growing economy. We don't have that now. We have both weak economic growth and increasing spending on the entitlement side particularly, that is at a far higher level, 100% debt to GDP ratio. So our debt is the size of our entire economy now. It hasn't been that way, of course, since World War II, and then it was defense spending that could be curtailed pretty much immediately, and we didn't have these long-term Medicare and Social Security issues that we have now. In fact, Medicare wasn't even in existence. So it's a different type of problem, and it's at a larger scope. So forgetting politics for a second, if we can, the changes that we make are going to have to be more fundamental, more difficult. And my own view, strongly held, and I don't think Xavier would disagree with me on this in general, is that it has to be both spending restraint. You can't continue to spend so much more than you take in, and you have to have growth. Back in 2007, when I was the budget director, I benefited from the fact, frankly, that we had growth in the economy. We were able to get a deficit down to $161 billion, which was about 1.2% of the economy. That wasn't too long ago, but it requires growth in addition to spending restraint. So I think it's harder, John, to be honest with you, and I think it has to be done very carefully to avoid having a devastating impact on our economy at a time when we still have the weakest recovery since the Great Depression.
So that it's substantively hard in addition to politically hard.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Congressman, what's your view of this?
John,
if you could just chase all the reporters away, could you get this done relatively easily?
If we could hang the special interests and the sacred cows at the door with our coat as we walk in and leave the egos behind as well, it is simple math. And we've got enough templates out there to guide us, whether it's Bowles-Simpson, Rivlin-Domenici. Both plans, bipartisan, both plans dealt with what I think most observers say must be the elements of a good compromise. That is, restraints on spending, changes, increases to real revenue, tax revenue, and making sure that the policies both interplay so that you have economic growth. And look, it's not rocket science. I think most of us have gone through this enough, whether it was Super Committee or Bowles-Simpson or the Biden group or Gang of Six, that we've seen this. And you can only do the movie so many times in different ways. And so I think you can get there. I honestly think the problem is that most of the folks who get to make the decision aren't experiencing the pain that those Americans who are on the cusp of losing their home or their job are suffering. It's like the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, where 1% of America is impacted by these two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we don't feel it. And I guarantee you, most of the folks on Capitol Hill don't feel the economic pain that today some American family is fighting through to make sure that they persevere. If we did, I think it'd be a lot easier to get this done. But the reality is, most of us who get elected don't have to worry about that. I don't think it's that tough. I'd be willing to deal with some of the programs that are near and dear to me, because what I've seen them do for families, including my parents, both who had a little chance to get educated. But I'm not willing to tell someone that I'm going to compromise, and the only thing that compromise is cuts to discretionary programs that are for families and working people and children.
Kathleen, we've got one view of the problem, that it's the egos in the room that makes a grand bargain impossible, or at least very hard. But I wonder if there's another view, which is just, it's not the egos in the room, but the divisions within the country that make this so hard. You've got one election in 2008 that points dramatically in one direction to the benefit of Democrats. You had another election in 2010 really points the exact opposite direction to the benefit of Republicans. Maybe what we need is not a backroom deal, but somehow for the public itself to decide which side is right and which side is wrong, instead of sending dramatically mixed signals.
Maybe what we need is a campaign that aligns campaigning to governance. One of the things that made welfare reform possible was candidate Clinton campaigned on it. You bring the electorate along, and as a result can govern more responsibly. And so the question should be, how does the media use its agenda-setting function to keep focused on the issues? And how does the media communicate the elite consensus about what needs to be done? How do we create structures that hold the candidates accountable, debates with good, strong follow-up questions? And also, perhaps, these proposal that the Kennedy School floated a few years ago, Sunday evenings devoted to candidates talking at length with each other with good moderation about these issues. And then how do we dampen down the deception, particularly in third-party advertising?
That's in lieu of or in addition to the presidential debates? Is that the...
In addition to the presidential debates, I think you can bring the public up to speed on these issues, to understand the elite consensus, to accept the trade-offs and the sacrifice, and to break through the barriers of polarization. There actually is an elite consensus here, and we're all going to have to sacrifice in some ways while trying to protect the vulnerable. The question is, can the public be raised up to a level of understanding that it will make the sacrifices, and also will see the benefits to future generation of doing that, and elect someone as a result who's able to govern responsibly? You know, we can campaign in ways that make it harder to govern. If we do that this year, we're going to be in real trouble.
Patricia, do you buy that? There's an elite consensus that gets muddied as this enters the realm of politics, or is it the fundamental antagonism itself? What's the problem? And actually, there really isn't an elite consensus. Because I would posit if there was such an elite consensus, Simpson-Bowles would have been more successful, the super committee would have been more successful, the very intense, and I guess at certain times at far advanced talks between President Obama and Speaker Boehner would have reached consensus.
Yeah.
So what's your...
If you're defining elite as members of Congress, there is no elite consensus. Right. I think that's very clear. If you define elites as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who has said that our debt and deficit is the greatest threat to our national security, if you define elites as leaders around local communities who understand budgets, understand how to balance the budget, and understand what's not happening. And I think the real consensus really is among the American people. I think the American people are way out ahead of their leaders on this. The leaders need to follow the people who are supposed to follow them.
What's your evidence for that?
I would say anecdotally, when I go around and talk to people, when I go to campaign events for Democrats and Republicans, when I just talk to people in cafes or in Starbucks and strike up conversations when I'm covering the presidential election, people are worried.
And you hear the people saying, I'm so worried you should cut my benefits. I'm
I
so worried I want to pay more tax.
I don't think the American people really know the difference between Simpson-Bowles and the Gang of Six. I think all of this really starts to cloud over. Right. They understand that something has to change. They understand there's something deeply out of balance. They understand numbers. They understand the direction that the deficit is going and the peril that the country is in. I think they understand that, and they understand that members of Congress are not making sacrifices in their own, sort of with their own constituencies in order to get across the finish line. It's the first time I think a lot of voters have seen taxation equated to morality, that there is something morally wrong with taxing people. I think they see just this calcification in Congress, and they're just very, very frustrated. So I think the consensus is not among the elite. I think the consensus is among the people. I also think that's why there's hope that there could be some movement on this issue, because elected leaders, I think, they hear that when they go home to their districts. I know that they do, but of course the question is, well, who are the winners and who are the losers? I think if you look back to 1986, when there was the tax reform, 1986 tax reform, each side gave away a good bit, but they felt like they were also winning for their constituencies also. And I think that that's key. Both sides are going to have to give, but they also have to feel like they're getting enough in return. You don't see that happening, and I don't think you see the leadership, and not even among the super committee, I'm not even talking about them, I don't think you see the leadership at the presidential level, at the congressional leadership level, that's really driving this. President Reagan drove tax reform. Dan Rostenkowski was deeply engaged in it. When the president gave his Oval Office address about tax reform, Dan Rostenkowski gave the Democratic response and said, we're here to work with you. We haven't heard that. So that's a long answer to your question, but.
Well, I'd like to agree with Patricia. I know that Kathleen talked about the elite consensus, and I haven't seen it yet. I mean, Kathleen, I think what you're talking about is more on the solutions, Simpson-Bowles.
Yes, if we can't grow our way out of it, we can't get enough money simply by spending cuts, and we have to be responsible about ensuring that we don't tank the economy.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of my constituents who are not part of the Washington elite would agree with everything you just said. And I think they're actually ahead of where Washington is. I mean, when I talk back home about you can't spend more than you take in, people kind of go like this because they've all got family budgets and a lot of them are in small business and they understand it doesn't work. So there's a sense out there that Washington is careening down a path toward a fiscal catastrophe, and there may be less consensus about solutions, but it's partly because of what Patricia is saying, the lack of leadership, and it does require leadership. And I will tell you, not to be partisan here, God forbid, but you know,
I have a feeling
but no, I think Patricia makes a good point, and it's not just about Ronald Reagan in 1983 and Social Security or Ronald Reagan and tax reform. It's about Bill Clinton and welfare reform that Kathleen raised. I mean, it's about presidential leadership, and partly, frankly, it's providing cover to your own party. And I'm not going to speak for Xavier, wouldn't dare do that, but I will say that Democrats need a little help. In terms of the super committee, we didn't have that. In fact, what we had was a veto threat. It wasn't done just the way President Obama wanted it done, and that's not leadership. So I think it requires a couple of things. One is taking that, what I think is a consensus among folks, not just the elite, that we're in a serious fiscal crisis now. I think crisis is not too strong a word to use. And second is, okay, leadership on what are the solutions, because you're right, people are concerned about raising taxes, they're concerned about cuts to popular benefit programs. But if there is a sense of the greater good and a sense of a solution and a way to, again, both have spending restraint and economic growth, I think people, ultimately reflected among the elected representatives here, can move this forward. But it requires leadership in terms of the solutions.
Go ahead,
John,
you've got to jump in.
2 years before President Reagan's tax reform in '86, he worked with Congress to pass a deficit reduction plan. 80% of that deficit reduction plan relied on tax revenue to work. We can't get unstuck here in Washington, D.C. because of the word taxes. And there is no way you resolve the depth of this deficit problem without dealing with taxes. And that's where I think the difficulty occurs with well-intentioned Republicans and well-intentioned Democrats. And Rob sort of said it as well. He talked about getting our spending under control, and he talked about economic growth. I mentioned that, spending controls, economic growth, and I'm willing to say that you have to deal with the tax side of things. There's no way you can't. When the largest contributor to the deficits over the last 10 years have been the Bush tax cuts because they were unpaid for, you've got to deal with it. And then if you're going to deal with the spending component, the budgetary side, the appropriation side of what Congress does, the discretionary aspect of what we allocate to services and programs, and you don't recognize that 2/3 of all the new spending since 2001 has come in one department, the Department of Defense, and yet you've got a crew in the House who wants to spare the Department of Defense of any savings whatsoever, in fact, is willing to increase the Department of Defense, then that means you're going to have to load all the cuts to services to Americans and taxpayers, education, health, clean air, clean water, food safety, and you can't do it. And so if you're not willing to talk taxes, and if you're trying to load it all on domestic discretionary services, it won't work. And so I think you do, John, have to essentially put people in that back room, tell them to hang their egos and their special interest pledges at the door, and then just don't come out until you come out with a plan. But there's just no way, realistically, we're going to deal with this. And none of the bipartisan plans that we have out today dealt with this without incorporating taxes in some fashion.
Well, we've got two partisans and two people who are approach this from a more neutral point of view. And Kathleen, your organization runs Fact Check.
And FlagCheck.org, an attempt to help the young come up to speed on these issues.
All right.
Good for you.
Is there an answer? Is it a pox on both your houses, or is one component of this more responsible for the 2011 failures to get a grand bargain? Democratic intransigence over spending, or Republican intransigence over taxation? They're both equally to blame, or would you say in the current political dynamic, one of those components is more?
I don't think it's productive to spend time asking who's to blame. I think there's plenty of blame to go around. I think the question is, how do we get where we need to go and bring the electorate along with us? When people campaign for the presidency, they do act on their promises most of the time. President Clinton is right about that. It approaches 75%. getting that laid out is very important. And when they campaign saying, read my lips, no new taxes, and they have to raise them, they're punished. When they campaign promising a middle-class tax cut and saying, I won't raise taxes to pay for my new programs, it's harder then for them to save the Congress when they raise taxes. So we need to ensure that we've made it possible to govern from this campaign, and I think that should be the focus, not looking back and placing blame. What's done is done.
It's been said that a second marriage is a triumph of hope over experience. And we heard President Clinton here say, you know what, I think that I'm paraphrasing here, but I think fairly, that the stars might be aligned after the election, perhaps in a lame duck session after the election or early in 2013. And you hear this line a lot, the argument being that enough factors are converging. The debt limit runs out, the tax cuts expire, the sequestration measures go into effect, and particularly aiming at the Department of Defense in a big way. What's your guess? Is there a grand bargain to be had late in 2012 or early in 2013 that eluded Washington in
I think there is certainly a bargain to be had that will come in the lame duck. There are pieces of obviously the Bush tax cuts and the sequestration and the unknown effect all of those expiring could have on the economy. I think it's going to matter a lot what happens in the election, which side gets the leverage, which side can go into the room and say, guess what, guys, we just won, and now we're in charge. And you can take your medicine now, or you can take your medicine later. So I think it's going to matter. There is no appetite for progress before the elections. It's very clear. I've asked lots of leaders, and they've said, sorry, blame the other guys, which is frustrating to hear. So I think there will certainly be movement. There will be a bargain because each side has so much to lose, and they have a lot to gain just by being able to come out of a room with the deal. And somehow in Washington, the only time people are focusing these days is during a lame duck session. I mean, there's the end of the year, there's the day that these things expire. There are now ratings agencies that are watching very carefully. The stakes are too high to do nothing. And then I think after the election, I think that there will be a time for a grand bargain. I think that it will be incumbent upon either the new president or the current president to solve this problem. I think that this is the task of the generation. We have kids coming out of college. You're scared for them. You're scared for the amount of debt they've taken on. You're scared for the economy they're inheriting. I think that there is sort of a moral component to solving this problem, that the next president will be able to enjoy the American people's support. And when you said, how do you know that people care about it? When Gallup asked just about a month ago, what is most important to you in this election? The debt was the #1 issue. And jobs were just a little bit behind that. The debt, people are focused on it. It's never been this way before. And I used to be a Hill staffer, and zero in a budget used to just be a road sign onto the place you were going. You're like, oh, we busted the budget. Sorry. That's the way it was. People literally didn't care about the budget, and now they do. And I think it has a lot to do with the Tea Party giving an earful to the Republicans, the Tea Party kicking some people out who people always thought would be safe. They're good people, but they weren't responding to their constituents in a lot of cases. And I hear Democrats talking about spending cuts in a way that you've never heard before. And so I think there is change. Failure isn't going to be fatal on this, but I do think kind of the 6 months to the year after the election is going to be the only time that the next president or the current president has to change it, and then we get right back into election mode, and we know what happens then.
What's your sense of timing? When do we have an appetite to take another swing?
We should take the swing right now, but because, as Patricia indicates, it's a little difficult during an election year, we absolutely have to before year end. And I would say, Patricia made a comment, we're not sure what the economic impact is going to be. I think we know enough to know that it will be devastating to the economy if we don't deal with these issues before year end. And some say that means kicking the can down the road for the new Congress and the new president, potentially, to deal with. Maybe, but it certainly ought to be under a strict deadline, and I hope expedited procedures in the Senate, where we have some issues with getting 60 votes. Look, if we don't do that, the Federal Reserve has told us, Chairman Bernanke has said, we're looking at maybe a 3-point drop in our GDP. Most people don't expect the GDP to be at 3 points at that stage. We were 2.2 in the first quarter this year, so we're talking about another recession. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has said the same thing. It would be devastating. So it's a combination of the huge tax increases and a combination of sequester and how it would work. This is across-the-board cuts. We also have a debt limit coming up, as you know, which for many of us on the Republican side is going to require some more focus on the spending, as many of us who voted for the debt limit increase last year insist that there be real spending restraint, and that's how we got the super committee and so on, and now have sequestration. So it's a time, John, when we do have an opportunity as a country to make some of these tough decisions. I would say, though, we have no choice but to do it. And I hope that Patricia's right, that both parties see it that way, see it in their interest to move forward. We simply have to. Javier talked earlier about some of the differences. We do have differences. I would disagree with some of his analysis, particularly the impact of the Bush tax cuts and where Republicans are on taxes and so on, and defense spending. But look, we can have those debates. We need to stick to the facts. And I think the fact is 24% of GDP in spending right now is historically high. We're headed toward, by the way, 30% under the likely scenario under Congressional Budget Office by 2030. This is unsustainable. We have to deal with the spending side. That is a fact. That's where we are. On the revenue side, it's relatively low. CBO also says that once the economy picks up, we'll be back to the historic average. But my view is we shouldn't be arguing about Bush tax cuts. We should be arguing about tax reform. And this is an opportunity for us not to keep the current code and add more taxes on top of it, but to reform the code in a way that economists across the board pretty much agree would result in a better economic climate and economic growth. And
Romney in Iowa today is going to give a big speech on this issue. Deficits, he's released at least part of the text already. One of the things he says in there is that this is like a prairie. He's in Iowa after all. He says this is like a prairie wildfire. And it doesn't care if it's a Republican House or a Democratic House, it's going to burn. And he says both parties are to blame for the mess we got in here. So in the spirit of doing painful things, I'm going to ask each of you to say, how is your party to blame for the current predicament? Congressman, you first.
Wow.
Sorry, Javier.
Kathleen, I think you meant to go to you first. To the degree that Democrats have had this long-standing concern that our colleagues on the Republican side were intent on eliminating or privatizing important programs that have helped, whether it's seniors to live in dignity or children to move up into a productive life, maybe Democrats have worked too hard to try to protect those programs from the devastating cuts. And in doing so, perhaps that has kept us from trying to come up with a smart budget. So I think Patricia said that Democrats are talking about making some spending reductions, and in fact, having agreed to the sequester process, indeed did so. Though all those are cuts on the discretionary side. Actually, there's some cuts there to some of the mandatory programs as well, but mostly all on the programs that we find near and dear to most American families, education and so forth. And so I think you do find that Democrats are willing to come halfway. The difficulty is when, by the way, I'm using CBO numbers, Rob, when it comes to the size of the Bush tax cuts, the $3.5 to $4 trillion that they cost us, none of it paid for, so we had to borrow money to do that, to do those Bush tax cuts. So they were the most important or most expensive element of the last 10 or so years in terms of what we have spent and what has driven some of these deficits. So I think many of us believe that it has to be a balanced approach. You just can't look at one side of the table. It has to be a very balanced approach to try to deal with this. And if you do so, you can do it in ways that I think will spur economic growth. I agree with Rob. The more we're able to reform the code, both corporate and individual, we'll be able to spur growth. But you can't talk about reforming the tax code simply to reform the code without dealing with these looming deficits and the fact that we have essentially spent through the tax code more money than we ever spend through the regular appropriations process. We haven't even talked about what Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson call the tax loopholes. The $1.1 trillion we spend every year. Every year, if we were to get rid of the tax loopholes that are in the books, we would not only do twice as much as Bowles Simpson did, but we would deal with a lot of the imbalance that we have in our tax code. Now, a lot of those tax breaks people have become accustomed to. So we have to figure out a way to do things so that we don't disorient the American family. But you can do a number of things without having to do violence to the American family and its ability to do what my parents did to me. Let me become the first in my family to get a college degree.
Senator, did you agree with the view that I think many Republicans have, which is that the lack of spending discipline, which we've seen in recent years, had its origins in the Bush administration, which you served, that there just was insufficient concern to the long-term costs of things like the Medicare prescription drug benefit and the rest?
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. And if you look back at the time period, 2001 on, after 9/11 particularly, I think there was a sense in this town that more needed to be spent on Homeland Security and defense. And on the other hand, Democrats were able to spend more on social programs. There was almost an unwritten agreement there that we were going to allow the spending to increase after getting to a balance and having a couple years of surpluses. And yeah, I think I've said this before, but President Bush should have vetoed appropriations bills prior to, I think, 2006, and the first one he vetoed. And at that point, frankly, spending did start to be restrained, and we had growth in the economy, and this is prior to the financial crisis. We actually got very close to balance, 1.2% of GDP. And we were on track not just to get close to balance, but we prepared, and I proposed a 5-year balanced budget at that point, believe it or not, and it's all, it's public record. So there was a sense that we were getting the spending back under control. Frankly, it was because continuing resolutions were governing the country, which is not the best way to govern, but there was no increase in domestic spending. And there were some changes in that budget on Medicare, for instance, including means testing that were new. So I do think that was the issue, though, that both Democrats and Republicans were partly to blame, took their eye off the ball. And again, some of it was understandable after 9/11, but it doesn't mean that it was the right thing to do. And so that's where I would be critical. Second, of course, is on the entitlement programs. As Xavier had said, incredibly important programs. We've got to have them. And they need to be strong, and the safety net needs to be there. But it's frayed, and it cannot continue as it is. The mandatory spending under the president's budget is 64% this year. In 10 years, he takes it to 78%. So this is the fastest growing part of the budget, by far the biggest part of the budget. And Republicans and Democrats alike have been unwilling to touch that third rail. And that has, going back to 1983, really is the last time there was a significant change in the entitlement programs. And so that's the challenge. And as I appreciate Javier's words today. We worked on this in the super committee. We actually came closer than folks in the media would acknowledge. But in the end, we were rebuffed by a lot of different factors. But it's got to be a combination. The growth side will add more revenue. I agree. We need more revenue, and we ought to get it in tax reform, and including, as you know, in the super committee, some of us on the Republican side put some proposals on the table that had static increases in revenue as well, with growth, pro-growth tax reform. And then on the entitlement side, we have got to deal with this issue, folks, otherwise it bankrupts the country.
Patricia, right now it seems to me, and I think polls reflect this, that you've got a radicalized center. That is, independents, moderates are just as anxious, just as frustrated with the status quo as we see on the left and the right, where we're accustomed to people being more extreme in their views. The last time we had that on this issue was in 1992. We had Ross Perot running a third-party candidacy on this issue, really putting it front and center. And it seems like the conditions are ripe, but where is the Ross Perot this time? He seems to be nowhere around.
I think a lot of independents are wondering where's our, maybe not Ross Perot, but where's the person speaking for us? Where's the person speaking our language? Where's the man or woman who knows what we're going through and is willing to take a step outside of politics to try and solve that problem? And I think going into this election cycle, I think people were thinking that there could be a third-party candidate, although the thinking was that if the Republican nominee was Romney, there might actually be a third-party candidate to the right of Romney. So it's difficult to say. I think that the parties are so strong, it's so difficult, you need so much money to run. There just aren't the people stepping up. There's this center of raging moderation, of flaming independence, but there aren't a lot of good choices for independents to pick from. And I think there are fewer and fewer independents, I think, in Congress. I think they're leaving, people from the center are leaving. They're either getting beaten in their own elections, getting a challenge from the right or left, or they're leaving of their own accord because it's so hard to be moderate. There is no reward for moderation right now in American politics,
Let me pick up on that. We've got 8 minutes left, and I want to, I hope, finish on a note of optimism But before we get there, I'd like to inject more of a note of pessimism, which is, you know, at least on a lot of the outward evidence, this problem isn't getting easier, it's getting worse. The problem of political will I'm describing. You've got moderate senators who are leaving the institution because they don't feel that there's a workable center. Senator, I believe your PAC was supporting Senator Lugar in his primary the other night, and he was defeated in part because he was seen as too willing to compromise. The parties are getting more divided. There's fewer conservative Democrats, fewer liberal Republicans. Isn't this getting harder as a political proposition rather than easier?
I think where it gets easier is where the American people, as Kathleen has said, begin to realize that this is at a crisis stage. We have to deal with it. If we don't, at year end, as I said, we're likely to be back in a recession. And it forces us to deal not just with, you know, kicking the can down the road, but fundamental changes in taxes.
What did you make of that Indiana result the other way? What does that say about our politics in Washington?
Well, it probably says a lot of things. Look, Dick Lugar is a good friend of mine, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that he didn't have a residency in his home state. I think the media has picked up some of the other aspects of that race, but missed the fact that there was a legitimate concern when he couldn't vote in his own election. I mean, you know, I think a lot of Republicans, more in the middle, more on one side or the other, all shared a concern about that. So that was part of the dynamic in that race. It began to shift, I think, when those issues started to come out, and then obviously in a Republican primary, the more conservative candidate who can articulate the issues sometimes has an advantage, and that was the case there. So, but look, I think it's not, maybe I'm naive about this, but it's not so much about your ideology as it is about your willingness to find a result. And I think we're hired to seek solutions and to help move the country forward and help our constituents. And I think whether you're Xavier, who tends to be more on the left side, or me more on the right side, if you go at it with that objective, I think it's inescapable what the conclusion is now. We've got to solve these problems. And if we don't, by the way, we're not going to have the economic growth that we all care about. And that's one thing I think that needs to be made more directly. And Kathleen, maybe the Ross Perot of this generation has to say more about the fact that it's not just about the charts and the numbers. It's about hope and opportunity. And if we do not solve this problem, the uncertainty, the unpredictability in our economy will not change. We will not have the robust recovery we all hope for to be able to help, you know, those young kids that Xavier talked about to have an opportunity in life, because you got 15% unemployment coming out of college these days. And, you know, if you look at the labor participation rate the way it was before President Obama got in, we're over 11% unemployment now. I mean, this won't change, in my view, until we deal with this problem. We've got to link these fiscal problems to the economic opportunity, and that will, I think, enable us to get a lot more support from Republicans and Democrats.
Congressman, do you believe that, what Senator Portman just said? Because there is an argument. I think the highest profile person to advance it is Paul Krugman in the New York Times. It says, look, it's the excessive concern about deficits that is retarding what should be the top priority, which is growth.
I don't think it's so much what Paul Krugman says. I think it's what the public has been saying for the last several years. I don't care if it's in a poll that you take today or the polls that have been taken over the last 3 or 4 years. More often than not, the public's way ahead of the politicians. And that's
right,
because
but the argument is if you took a real swig of castor oil to do something on the deficit, that it would hurt the economy.
Well, and I think the public would tell you, we want to decrease these deficits, but we don't want to do it if it's going to cause us to lose jobs. We don't want to see a deficit reduction plan that says, don't build those highways, don't repair those bridges, that the transportation authorization bill would provide us. And so I think the public is very much in tune with what we need to do. In fact, I bet you that they would say the biggest deficit we face today is a jobs deficit. And if you get people back to work, guess what? They're paying taxes. And if they're paying taxes, the Treasury has more money. The Treasury has more money, lower deficits. And so if we could all agree, and I think there are enough folks on both sides of the aisle of goodwill who want to get something done, and I think I would certainly put myself there, and I know I could put Rob in that category, that we could get something done still, even though we're losing good folks. Olympia Snowe, Senator Snowe is leaving. She's always been part of a bipartisan solution. To lose her on the Republican side, I think is very telling. But at the end of the day, we have to take a look at the numbers. My biggest concern is that we will do more harm by acting than by not, because we have a fail-safe mechanism. We have something in place that can give us some $7 trillion in deficit reduction without Congress having to meddle politically. And that's, as you mentioned, all these expiration, the expiration of all these different programs. So rather than tweak and increase the deficits by doing this or that, recognize that right now, in law, we can save over $7 trillion in the deficits if we allow the law to take effect come December 31st, January 1st. And we can take advantage of the fact that we can tweak some of what would take place on January 1st and still have deficit reduction as big as, if not bigger than, Bowles-Simpson. So we can do a number of things sitting down together.
I want to make sure I'm hearing you right, though. It sounds like you're saying, like, hey, maybe we can take the few months off at the end of the year and get this problem solved.
No, see, John, to me,
you're better off not working than working.
I guarantee you most everyone in this room right now is not suffering economically. But yet there are millions of Americans who are. I guarantee you, on January 1st, when we have this Armageddon that we keep talking about of all these the expiration of all these tax provisions, the sequester going into effect, most of those Americans aren't going to be hit as hard as if, for example, we don't do something about the interest rates on student loans in a month.
Right.
That interest rate hike will cost most students about $1,000. That's more than they get in the Bush tax cuts.
Right.
And so the reality is we're not talking about middle America here. And if we were, we'd be willing to do the tough stuff the way we've asked the guys that served three terms, three deployments in Iraq.
I'm going to give everybody, you may have discerned in some of my questions a note of skepticism or even pessimism about this, but I want to finish on an upbeat note. And so why don't we in our remaining time, we'll go down from far to closer to me and answer this question as concisely as is possible. I'm optimistic this problem will be solved and the political will be found because what?
Because I think that we'll get an election behind us, we'll have a little breathing room, and I really do believe that the people who come to Washington come here for the right reasons, and they're almost all people of goodwill, and leaders are gonna step forward. They always have. This country has made it this far with a lot of significant problems to solve, and we've always solved them. So I don't have any specific reason to be optimistic other than I think that the leaders will rise to the level of the people that they're trying to lead.
All right. Kathleen?
In 1992,
what makes you so cheerful?
In 1992, Ross Perot helped center the deficit as a concern on the national agenda. I think he made it easier for President Clinton to act responsibly. We now have Simpson-Bowles and Rivlin Domenici. We have the equivalent of a Ross Perot surrogate in those. If we can find a way to center that discussion in the national dialogue of the campaign, I think a responsible media can do that. Responsible candidates and those held accountable by media can do that. I think we can have a campaign that will forecast governance and make it easier to address these very serious problems for future generations.
John, I think the middle class is going to wake up and they're going to speak very loudly, whether it's in this election or future elections. I think with democracy, obviously the ship turns very slowly, but I think the middle class, that the heart of America that's kept us going, is going to wake us up and make us do things if we ourselves can't. But I think the answers are there. It's simple math, and we can do it without having to have the middle class push us into doing the right thing.
All right. Senator Sunshine, give us a reason to be upbeat.
Well, listen, you mentioned that Governor Romney's given a speech, which I didn't realize, but on tax reform. And again, at the risk of being partisan here, I love the fact that he's talking about pro-growth tax reform. Not tax cuts, by the way. He's talking about pro-growth tax reform that will generate more revenue. And he's willing to talk about the very politically sensitive issue of entitlement reform. And he's been talking about it, through the primaries. You all don't cover it much, but it's out there. And I think that will force a debate on these issues. I agree with Kathleen. It's hard to see us coming together in lame duck or after the first of the year without a presidential campaign that focuses on these issues. And I think, folks are gonna hear two different approaches. And I think most people are going to say, we got to address these issues. We can't continue to allow Congress to kick the can down the road to avoid these problems, and I think they're directly related to the economy. And that's one reason I'm optimistic. I think they are related to the economy, and if more of us make that connection, including in the media, I think more people will be interested, because Javier's right, jobs is the issue. That's also important to folks, but jobs is the issue. I think they're inextricably connected. And by the way, if we don't solve this problem at year end, a recession is going to hurt every middle-income family in America, so we've got to deal with this issue.
All right, 40 minutes. We've got it licked. I think I'm deserve the Nobel Prize for bringing such clarity and consensus to the issue. In less than an hour, we've solved our long-term problem. Thank you all very much. Our panelists really offer great insights into all.